In the year 1776, there was no such thing as an American. There were Virginians and New Yorkers, Bostonians and Carolinians, 13 separate colonies strung along the edge of a continent, each with its own laws, its own money, its own quarrels. They distrusted their king in London, but they distrusted each other nearly as much. Nothing about them suggested a nation, and yet within a single generation, these scattered, arguing colonies would declare themselves free, fight the most powerful empire on earth, and invent a new kind of country, built not on a bloodline or a border, but on an idea. This is the story of how that happened. The road to revolution did not begin with a cry for freedom. It began with a bill. In 1763, Great Britain stood triumphant, having just won a world war against France. The conflict Americans called the French and Indian War. But victory was expensive. Britain was staggering under debt, and its leaders reached a simple conclusion. The colonies had been defended by British soldiers, so the colonies should help pay the cost. The taxes came one after another, the Sugar Act. Then in 1765, the Stamp Act, a tax on every printed paper in the colonies, from newspapers to playing cards. To London, it was ordinary policy. To the colonists, it was something else entirely. They had no representatives in Parliament, no voice in the vote. And so a phrase spread from Massachusetts to Georgia: no taxation without representation. Resistance hardened into organization. Men calling themselves the Sons of Liberty took to the streets. Merchants boycotted British goods. And when soldiers were sent to keep order in Boston, friction turned to blood. On a cold night in March 1770, a nervous line of redcoats fired into a jeering crowd, killing 5. The Boston Massacre, the colonists called it, and the name itself was a weapon. Then came the tea. In December 1773, colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors dumped more than 90,000 pounds of British tea into Boston Harbor. Britain's answer was fury, a series of punishing laws the colonists named the Intolerable Acts, shutting Boston's port and stripping Massachusetts of self-government. London meant to isolate one unruly colony. Instead, it united all 13. In the autumn of 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress. They did not yet speak of independence. They spoke of their rights as Englishmen and hoped the king would listen. But across Massachusetts, ordinary farmers were already cleaning muskets and hiding gunpowder, drilling on village greens as Minutemen. Ready, they said, at a minute's notice. On the night of April 18, 1775, British troops marched out of Boston to seize a colonial arms cache at Concord. Riders, among them a silversmith named Paul Revere, galloped ahead to raise the alarm. At dawn on April 19th, on the green at Lexington, the two sides met. A single shot rang out. No one knows from which side. And the age of argument was over. By nightfall, the British were retreating under fire from behind every wall and tree. A poet would later call it the shot heard round the world. The Second Continental Congress convened with a war already underway. It created a Continental Army, and to command it chose a tall, reserved Virginian with a reputation for steadiness under fire, George Washington. Still, many delegates clung to hope of reconciliation. The break was not yet made. It would take a pamphlet to make it. In January 1776, an obscure English immigrant named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. In plain, blazing language, it did what years of petitions had not. It argued that it was absurd for a vast continent to be ruled by a distant island. and that monarchy itself was a fraud. It became a sensation, read aloud in taverns, passed hand to hand, reprinted in town after town, and changed minds by the thousand. Independence was no longer unthinkable. It was suddenly common sense. That summer, Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. The writing fell to a 33-year-old Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. On July the 2nd, 1776, Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, it adopted the document that explained why. Its heart was a single, revolutionary sentence, that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was a claim without precedent, that government exists not to serve a king, but to secure the rights of the governed, and that a people may abolish a government that fails them.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
It was also a promise only half kept. The man who wrote that all men are created equal enslaved more than 100 human beings. The all of 1776 did not include the enslaved, or native peoples, or women. The Declaration set a standard its own authors did not meet, handing later generations both an ideal and an argument. For the 56 men who signed, the immediate meaning was starker. They had put their names to treason. If they lost, they would hang. Declaring independence was one thing, surviving it was another. Britain possessed the finest navy in the world and a professional army. The Americans had a ragged force of short-term volunteers, chronically short of muskets, shoes, and money. Through the second half of 1776, Washington was beaten again and again around New York and driven in retreat across New Jersey. The cause seemed all but lost.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman.
Then on the frozen night of December 26, 1776, Washington ferried his army back across the ice-choked Delaware and struck the enemy garrison at Trenton in a surprise attack. It was a small victory, but it kept the revolution alive. The true turning point came in October 1777, when American forces surrounded and captured an entire British army at Saratoga. That victory convinced France, Britain's great rival, that the Americans could win. In 1778, France entered the war as an ally, bringing money, ships, and soldiers. A colonial rebellion had become a global war. Survival still came at a terrible price. That winter, Washington's army camped at Valley Forge, where as many as 2,000 perished, most of them from disease. Yet out of that suffering, drilled by a Prussian volunteer named von Steuben, a true professional army finally took shape. The end came at Yorktown, Virginia, in the autumn of 1781. Trapped against the sea by Washington's army and a French fleet, the British commander, Lord Cornwallis, surrendered his entire force. 2 years later, in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, Great Britain formally recognized what had once seemed impossible: the United States of America, free and independent. The war was won, but a war won is not a nation made, and the United States very nearly came apart in peace. During the war, the states had bound themselves under a first framework, the Articles of Confederation. It was by design weak: no president, no real courts, and fatally, no power to tax. Congress could beg the states for money but could not compel them. Debts went unpaid. Trade disputes festered. In 1786, when desperate farmers in Massachusetts rose in armed revolt, Shays' Rebellion, the national government could barely raise the force to answer it. To many, it looked as if independence might dissolve into 13 squabbling little republics. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered again in Philadelphia, officially to revise the Articles. Instead, behind locked doors and shuttered windows, they scrapped them and built something new. Large states demanded representation by population. Small states demanded equality. The deadlock broke with the Great Compromise, a Congress of two chambers, a House by population, a Senate where every state stood equal. Not every compromise was noble. To hold the slave-holding states in the Union, the framers agreed to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person and to shield the slave trade for 20 years. A contradiction stitched into the nation's founding, one that would one day be paid for in blood. On September 17, 1787, the delegates signed the Constitution. It still had to be ratified, and the fight was fierce. In its defense, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote the Federalist Papers. State by state, it was approved. In 1789, Washington was inaugurated as the first president. In 1791, a Bill of Rights secured the liberties the Revolution had been fought to protect. So what in the end was founded? Not a finished country. In 1789, the United States was poor, fragile, and deeply divided, its grandest promises unmet for millions of its own people. What the founders created was not a perfect nation, but an experiment, a wager that ordinary people could govern themselves, written down in words that reach further than their authors could yet live up to. That was the genius and the burden of the American founding. It set an ideal that all are created equal, and then left the work of becoming it to everyone who came after. The revolution did not end in 1783 or in 1791. In a sense, it never ended at all. Every generation since has argued over the meaning of those words and struggled to make the country match them. The United States was not born free and equal. It was born arguing about what free and equal should mean. And that argument, restless, unfinished, and profoundly human, is the true story of how America was made.